Brigid Berlin was a bundle of contradictions. She was an heiress. She was born on the Upper East Side to an extremely wealthy, influential family. Her father was the president of the Hearst Media Corporation, and so her childhood is spent surrounded by wealthy, influential, powerful, beautiful people. She also was a mole person, which was this underground group of people that surrounded Andy Warhol in the really early days of the factory that was primarily comprised of homeless drug addicts. But she wasn't a drug addict. Well, she didn't think of herself as a drug addict. She loved speed, but that was a respectable drug in her mind. She hated weed, she hated LSD, she hated hippies, and she hated rock and roll. She did not like to think of herself as an artist, but at the end of her life, she left behind this huge body of work, including many, many paintings and photographs. She thought of herself as this very respectable, upper class kind of conservative lady, but she did have a very notable sadistic streak. And she also didn't like to think of herself as an Andy Warhol groupie. She kind of claimed she didn't like Andy Warhol at all, but out of everyone at the factory, Brigid Berlin maintained the closest relationship to Andy Warhol, and she spoke to him on the phone for hours, literally every day until he died in 1987. So who was Brigid Berlin? Well, we are going to get into that, but before we do, hi, I'm Kate Name, and I am the creator of The Factory, which is an immersive show about the world of Andy Warhol and the events that led to his attempted assassination by Valerie Solanas. The concept is simple. You, as the audience, are invited to a party at the factory where you can sit for your own screen test, you can film an underground movie, you can help silkscreen paintings, rock out with the band, and maybe you can be named Andy Warhol's next superstar. It's a really fun, crazy, wild show, and I've been working on it for a very long time, literally years at this point, and I have some fun announcements. I just found out, like literally last week, that I won, one of the winners of the NISCA grant, which is a New York State grant that funds the arts. It's a $10,000 grant, so hugely, hugely excited about being a NISCA grant winner. And I have some fun updates. I have an event happening in February at $3 Bill that I will have more details about very, very soon. And of course, I will have more info about the show itself really, really soon. And to that end, if you want to be in the know and find out about all of these things before everyone else, I do have a Patreon now. So would love you to join the Patreon. There's inside scoops, access to tickets early, all sorts of fun things. So go over there and check it out. Link will be in the bio. I also want to say, if it's the end of the year, if you want to donate at all, this grant is like really, really exciting, and it's a really large grant, but immersive theater is very expensive to produce, and I'm an independent producer. I am doing all of this myself. This YouTube channel, writing the show, raising the money, producing the show, like literally it's just me. So if you want to help and donate, the show is fiscally sponsored by Fractured Atlas, which is a nonprofit arts organization. So all donations are tax deductible. So if you want to donate, that would be amazing. But if you just want to help and you don't have the funds, I totally understand. And the best way to help me get this show into the real world is to subscribe to this YouTube channel. It really genuinely helps, and I really, really appreciate it. And we're having a lot of fun here. We're talking about all sorts of Warhol and factory and 60s related things. So I have a lot of fun content planned, so please subscribe. We would love to have you. Okay, so all of that being said, let's talk about Brigid Berlin. So Brigid Berlin was born to this incredibly wealthy, well-connected family. She's born September 6th, 1939, and she's the oldest of 4 children. Her family has 2 boys and 2 girls. So she has one sister, her little sister Richie, who she was the closest to. And her family is really at the center of everything. Being like, the Hearst Media Corporation, if you're a Newsies fan, you know. But the Hearst Corporation was a huge power player in politics and entertainment and advertising and like literally every facet of culture and life, her father had kind of a hand in. So he's friends with the mayor. Brigid grows up with like Ethel Merman and Clark Gable coming to Christmas dinner. When General Douglas MacArthur came back from the Korean War, they had this huge ticker tape parade for him in New York City. And Brigid, at like 11 years old, rode in the car directly behind him. So she grows up kind of thinking that she is a celebrity, just born into celebrity. She's kind of like a Northwest type person. Like her family is so well connected that she just comes into the world feeling like she is somebody, and she kind of is. And her father and mother are not super emotionally involved with Brigid's life, and her father and mother have kind of a big age gap. Her mother was this socialite named Honey Berlin, who was 21 years old when she gets married to Brigid's father. Her father, Richard E. Berlin, was like 43 when he gets married. So big age gap with her parents. And her mom is just kind of a socialite in the way that socialites often are, in that she really only cared about appearances. And Brigid comes to associate kind of performing with love. Her father had this 16mm camera, which is funny because Andy Warhol filmed his early movies on a 16mm Bolex camera. And so some of Brigid's earliest memories are of her father filming Brigid running towards him. He would always take these videos of Brigid running towards him as a small child. And as a reward for performing well, her father would give her treats. And so Brigid starts to associate food with love and reward with love and performing with love. And so really, really early on, she's exposed to performing for the camera and eating. And Brigid likes to eat. She struggles with her weight for most of her life, but it starts really, really early on. Her mom, Honey Berlin, is absolutely horrified by the thought of having an overweight daughter. She takes it as a personal insult, a personal affront. She thinks that Brigid is doing this to her, basically. And so she severely punishes Brigid and restricts her diet. And so she gets put on all these very intense diets really early on. And if you've seen diets from this era, you know that they're kind of insane. There's this very famous viral diet from the 70s that's you eat a hard-boiled egg and smoke a cigarette and drink a glass of wine, and that's the diet, and you repeat that all day. Just eat eggs and smoke cigarettes and drink wine. It's crazy. It's clearly not healthy. Or Judy Garland, for example, when she's filming The Wizard of Oz, they put her on a diet of chicken broth and cigarettes and diet pills. So when we say she was put on a diet, I really don't know what that means, but we can assume that it was not enjoyable and probably extremely restrictive. So Brigid pretty much immediately figures out ways to thwart the diet. She will convince the nannies to sneak her food. She would sneak food herself. And she also figured out a way of jimmying the scale. She would use her wadded up underwear and stick it into the scale to mess it up. So that her weight was not accurate when she would step on the scale. So she never intended to follow any of these diets. She's I'm gonna get what I want. As she gets older, she gets way more bold with getting food. And so she would get up early, telling her, this is how dedicated she was. She would tell her parents that she was going to school early to study. She would sneak into her father's study and peel a $100 bill off the top, which he never noticed, because he's outrageously wealthy. And she would use the $100 bill to go to the store, and she would get candies and treats and donuts and snacks. Then she'd go up the street at 7:30 and go to a diner and have a turkey melt. And she was eating, I have no idea what when it comes to calories, but she could really put it away. It gets so bad that her parents are really at their wits' end with dealing with Brigid and her mania around food. And so they hire a hypnotist, and this hypnotist tries to hypnotize Brigid, and he tells her when she's under hypnosis that all treats and snacks and bad food now taste like codfish cakes. And she like comes out of the session and she immediately runs down the street. She goes to a newsstand and she buys a bunch of candy bars and she eats them and she realizes, oh, thank God, they don't taste like codfish cakes. They taste fine. Hypnotism does not work. Whew. And so, because she once again has thwarted her parents, they resort to more extreme measures and they get her prescribed amphetamines to fight her weight loss. So really, really early on, she's taking amphetamines and they're given to her by her parents. So Brigid grows up and sometime in 1960, 21-year-old Brigid marries this window dresser named John Parker. And I could not find very much at all about this marriage. I couldn't find out the day they got married or the day they got divorced. Literally very, very little information. The only information I could find actually comes from Andy Warhol's book Popism, where he describes Brigid Berlin trying to bring her new fiance to her parents' house to introduce him. And when they get there, Brigid's mother, Honey Berlin, tells the doorman to make John Parker wait outside on a bench across the street in Central Park. And she talks to Brigid and she gives Brigid a $100 bill as a wedding present. And she says that she should use it to go buy new underwear at Bergdorf's. And she says, good luck with that fairy. So doesn't sound like her parents approved of this man and this marriage, but I don't know anything else about it. So they get divorced at some point after that. It was a very brief marriage, so probably still while she's 21 or 22. And then around the same time, at the end of 1960, in September, Brigid inherits $150,000 from a family friend as an inheritance. And her parents had told this person, like, do not do this. Do not let Brigid have your money. She's just gonna spend it all. But this person doesn't care, apparently, and leaves Brigid the money. She starts spending like crazy. She gets an apartment on the Upper East Side and furnishes it with like very expensive antiques. She also rents a summer house in Fire Island, which is kind of like a gay neighborhood area in New York City. Well, not in New York City, but on Fire Island. And she calls it Brigid Dune. And she would do things like send out 300 invitations for lunch. And then all these gay guys would come over and she would just have plates and plates of lobster and poppers. So gay icon early on, very ahead of her time. So Brigid flies through this inheritance in record time, but even after she runs out of money, she doesn't really care. She just will charge things to her father's account, or worst comes to worst, she just would waltz into her parents' very huge mansion on the Upper East Side and steal things from her parents and then sell them for cash. So she would always she was resourceful and she would find a way to make money. She was used to having it. And I think in her mind, she just was entitled to it. So by the early 1960s, Brigid, now I assume divorced from her ex-husband, is a very experienced amphetamine user, but up until this point, she's only been taking pills. And so she's ready to level up. And she goes to see this doctor, Dr. Freeman on the Upper East Side. And she shows up and she looks very much the Upper East Side wealthy lady. She's wearing a Chanel suit and a Hermes scarf. And she's terrified at the thought of being injected for the first time. And she asks the doctor, is this going to hurt? And the doctor responds by snatching her scarf and tying it around his eyes like a blindfold, and then saying, I'm about to make you feel better than any man has ever made you feel in your life. And then he shoots her up. And this shot was a combination of methamphetamine and vitamin B12. And Brigid is hooked. She loves this. And she starts bringing her younger sister, Richie, to these very luxurious appointments where the nurses have fresh strawberries and ginger ale waiting for them. And there's these bowls of complimentary amphetamine pills just in the lobby for you to take. So this is the most fancy, wealthy way to do meth that I've ever heard. But soon, one doctor is not enough for Brigid. She has a notoriously large appetite for everything. And so she finds another doctor in addition to the first doctor. And the second doctor she finds is this guy named Dr. Max Jacobson. Now, if you are familiar with the 1960s, you might be familiar with this name. He also more famously went by the name Dr. Feelgood. And he had a very extensive list of extremely wealthy, influential clients, including John F. Kennedy and Tennessee Williams and Winston Churchill. And so Brigid, being this very upper class, well-connected lady, she gets in with Dr. Feelgood and she starts seeing him. And his shots were kind of crazy. He was very experimental with his methods and very cavalier with how he was doing these shots. And so his shots include amphetamine, steroids, placenta, calcium, and liver cells. So she starts going to the first doctor, Dr. Freeman, and now Dr. Feelgood. And so she's doing this two-doctor thing for a while, and then she decides this still is not enough, and she levels up and she adds a third doctor to her rotation. And this doctor is called Dr. Bishop, and by this point, her and her sister Richie were kind of structuring their whole days around getting these shots. They would go to Dr. Freeman in the morning, get some shots, Dr. Feelgood in the afternoon, get some more shots, and then they would go to the last doctor, Dr. Bishop, in the evening and get even more shots. So Brigid describes her day, and she says that this was affecting her quite a bit. She says, "I got so thin, but it made me shop. Oh my God. We'd leave there and beeline it to Bloomingdale's, and we'd change our outfits as we went through the store. We'd just leave whatever we were wearing in the dressing room and buy the new thing and then charge it to our parents." So her and Richie are having a grand old time, very, very hopped up on amphetamines and just like speeding around New York City, shopping and being crazy. So around this time in the early 1960s, summer of 1963 specifically, this group starts to form that I mentioned earlier in the intro of this video, and they're called the Mole People. And they are not the mole people that live under the subway in New York City. I want to clarify that because that also is a group of people that's called the Mole People. Different mole people. These mole people were a very like artistically inclined, mainly homosexual, some bisexual, very open acceptance of kind of all sexualities. And they were drawn together by shared love of opera and amphetamines. Now, I have mentioned the Mole People many times in past videos, so I will try to keep this really brief. But if you don't know, just to give you some context, the Mole People were called the Mole People because they only came out at night, and they were mostly homeless, and they would just come out at night. They were super pale because they never saw the sun, and they would have these floating parties all around the city where they would do drugs. And they would listen to opera. That was a really big thing. They loved opera, but mostly they would find these places to do drugs. And the Mole People were really, really instrumental in the early days of the factory because the Mole People had some significant members: Ondine, Billy Name, and Gerard Malanga. And these three people were like the architects of the factory. Billy Name was asked by Andy Warhol to move in the early days, right when Andy Warhol signed the lease on the factory space. Billy Name moves in to help basically make the factory safe for Andy to work in. Billy Name was kind of a jack of all trades. He knew how to be an electrician, and he was the one that actually put foil on his own walls in his apartment. And Andy came to Billy's apartment and saw all the foil on the walls because I don't know if you know much about people who do speed, but oh, they love to do little busy work with their fingers. So he had like covered in an amphetamine-induced mania. He had covered his whole apartment in tinfoil. And Andy Warhol had seen it and was like, "Oh my God, this looks amazing. I just got this new studio space. Billy, you should come and do this silver thing at my studio." And so Billy moves in and he is putting the foil on the walls and making it safe to work there. And Gerard was also a mole person, and he was Andy's assistant. Gerard had actually been working with Andy Warhol at the Firehouse, which was Andy Warhol's studio before he signed the lease on the factory space. So really early on, before the factory even got off the ground, Andy Warhol and Gerard Malanga were working together on Andy's silkscreen paintings. So Gerard and Andy were already a team. And then Ondine was really the focal point of the Mole People. He was like king mole person. And so when Billy Name and Gerard Malanga start hanging out with this Andy Warhol guy, Ondine comes and starts to hang out with them too because, again, most of the mole people were homeless. And so when Andy Warhol opens his factory, and Andy Warhol likes to have people around him 24 hours a day, and Billy Name lives at the factory and has the keys, and everyone can be there 24 hours a day, the mole people slowly start to migrate over to the factory because now they have a place to hang out and do their drugs whenever they want. So that was what was going on kind of in the early factory days. And so Brigid starts to fall in with the mole people, and she actually, being a wealthy socialite lady, she's very tuned to the hierarchy in social structures. She's very good at entering a room and figuring out who's the most powerful person here, who's the most influential person here. That's the person that I need to be friends with. And so she does the same thing when she gets in with the mole people, and she identifies the true important person within the mole person community, and it's this guy named Rotten Rita. And Rotten Rita was the most important person because he was the drug dealer. He was the one that was providing the amphetamines. So Brigid Berlin actually becomes really good friends with Rotten Rita first. And Rotten Rita his real name was something not that. It was Kenneth Rapp, but nobody ever called him that. They called him Rotten Rita. And Danny Fields, who's a really interesting person, by the way. I was thinking about this. Maybe we should do a Danny Fields video sometime down the road. Danny Fields was like, he worked with the Velvet Underground, and then he helped manage Iggy and the Stooges, and he discovered the Ramones at CBGB. Like, Danny Fields, most important person you've never heard of when it comes to punk music and rock music. But he actually was a really good friend of Edie Sedgwick. That's how he got kind of introduced to this world. And Danny Fields talks about the mole people, and he says that they were those who moved through a transitional stage from beatnik into a more stylized, campy version. So they were kind of like on the cutting edge of like avant-garde, underground, like boundary pushing, creative society. So anyways, Rotten Rita has this apartment on the Upper West Side where he does his drug dealing. And so Brigid would go and spend days at a time with Rotten Rita, where she would bring all of her little things that she would need in her purse. And she would go to Rotten Rita's and do a bunch of speed. And then she would work in her trip books, which were these notebooks that she would fill with very intricate, detailed designs. Like I said, people on speed get very hyper-focused on things that really do not matter, but in their minds, they're the most important thing that they could possibly be doing. So Brigid Berlin is hanging out with Rotten Rita at Rotten Rita's apartment, and one day, Rotten Rita gets a phone call from Ondine saying that he wants to hang out, and Rotten Rita is like, oh, you should meet my friend. And Rotten Rita had bestowed a nickname on Brigid Berlin. He called her the Duchess. Brigid Berlin actually had a few nicknames. She also called herself Brigid Polk. Well, she called herself Brigid Polk, really. It was meant to like be a nod to pokes, like giving yourself injections, but she spelled it like the president. So it's kind of this play on words. So sometimes she went by Brigid Berlin, sometimes she went by Brigid Polk, and sometimes she went by the Duchess. And so Ondine calls Rotten Rita and wants to hang out, and Rotten Rita was like, you gotta meet the Duchess. She's crazy. And so they meet in this bar on 2nd Avenue called Dinko. And immediately, Ondine and Brigid have like this very kinetic interaction. It almost sounds like they hated each other on sight, but the opposite is true. They actually loved each other. This is what they said. So Ondine said of the meeting, it turned out to be this Brigid Berlin monster. And Brigid said, he can really drive me to the point of insanity. I can't take it. But they really were like these kindred spirits. And Ondine would say, she isn't breaking capillaries, she's breaking brain cells. Can't you hear her brain cells popping? And they just would feed off each other's energy. And so once they start hanging out together, this is really when the factory culture kind of solidifies. And it's this energy between Ondine and Brigid, who can both talk a mile a minute and who are both like operating at like the top of their brain cells because they're both on speed all the time, but they're both brilliant and they're both funny and they're both biting and they both can read people to filth. And so when the two of them are in the factory together, the energy gets wild. So once Brigid becomes a regular at the factory, both the pace of the factory and the presence of amphetamines becomes a lot more palpable. Like literally the speed is speeding through them. It is pumping through their veins, and just the pace of everything starts to get a little more crazy. And what's interesting is that Brigid and Undine were the only people who could get Billy named to leave the factory at all. Otherwise, he was just very focused on his work. And Billy was kind of like this mystic presence, like very silent, meditative kind of person. And so the three of them would leave the factory sometimes and they would get in a cab, and Billy would just be like sitting there silently, like taking in the vibes. And Undine and Brigid are just like going a mile a minute, and like they just have the mayhem of a conversation. And so the three of them would just ride around in taxi cabs, like being on drugs and driving everywhere and being crazy. And Brigid would say that like, I didn't really care for Andy Warhol. She says that she was not an Andy Warhol groupie and that she really only cared about Billy and Undine. That's who she liked at the factory, and she didn't care if Andy Warhol was there or not. I don't think that's totally true, but that's what she said. Now, around this time is when something happens with the mole people that I think kind of illustrates Brigid's darker side. Mary Warno writes in her memoir, Swimming Underground, which, by the way, highly recommend if you are interested in the Warhol story. I think Mary has a very, very interesting take on the whole scene that a lot of other books about Warhol really focus on the art and like the social effects of Warhol and all of those things. And Mary has like a very inside look at like the social world of Warhol, and I find that fascinating. So if you also are interested in that, you should read that book. But she writes in her memoir about this incident with this mole person named Jimmy Smith. And Jimmy Smith was like this super friendly, incredibly well-liked guy within the mole people, but he had started stealing and robbing people to feed his addiction. But he was a friendly guy, and so for some reason, he would only steal from his friends, and he would also warn his friends ahead of time. He'd be like, hey, just so you know, I'm going to steal from you. And once he warned you, like there was nothing you could do. He was going to steal from you. But Mary says it wasn't even all bad. Like sometimes he would take just really weird things, and then he would often leave a more valuable item in its place. So it was more like an exchange of objects than necessarily like just flat out stealing. And so most of the mole people were like kind of okay with it, except this guy Oscar. And Oscar hated that Jimmy was doing this. And what's funny is that most people in the mole people group didn't really like Oscar because he was very selfish and he would always hoard his drugs and he wouldn't share with anybody, which makes sense why he would be the person most bothered by the stealing. The other mole people like kind of don't care that Oscar is getting robbed because they don't really like him that much in the first place. But Oscar he cannot take it. He cannot take Jimmy stealing from him. And no matter what he does, he can't stop Jimmy. He calls the cops. He changes the locks. He puts bars on the windows, and Jimmy keeps breaking in. And so he takes kind of drastic measures, and he decides to electrify the gates around his window. And he warns Jimmy. He says, Jimmy, I've electrified the gates. Do not try and rob me. And Jimmy will not be deterred. And so one night, who knows what time it was really, all the moles are at Oscar's apartment and they are all on drugs and they are obsessively stringing beads. They're making all these necklaces and they're beading for hours at a time. Some of the mole people at this point have been at Oscar's apartment for days, stringing beads. So they're all there doing their mole person thing, and all of a sudden they are like jolted out of their like amphetamine induced mania by this like very loud sound and kind of jolt of energy. And so one of the mole people bursts into the room and they say, Jimmy's dead. And the mole people rush to the window, and this is what Mary says about it. The final crash was terrible. You could tell it was something human sliding off the building and dropping into the alley, and we all knew what it was. There were awful popping noises while Jimmy was stuck to the gate, but worst of all was the smell of charred flesh. I had never seen anyone die before, but this was the first time any of us had to smell a guy die. I know Andine felt bad. He was the only one who had not gone to the window to watch. The Duchess, on the other hand, remained at the window well past dawn with a dildo down her pants. So, that's disturbing. I find that incredibly disturbing. I don't know how true that story is. A lot of Mary's writing is kind of from her point of view, like her mental state on drugs. So there's a lot of things she says that are kind of like hallucinations. So I'm not 100% clear on if this actually happened, but the way that she writes it makes me think that it did happen. And if that's true, that's crazy and I hate it. So I just want to put that out there. Like, I don't even know what to say about that. I think that's insane, and I find it quite disturbing. So it's a window into Brigid Berlin. So summer of 1965 is when Andy Warhol gets really into tape recording. And we haven't talked about this on the channel at all, but Andy Warhol really loved being on the telephone. He found it much more comfortable to be kind of hidden behind the baffle of the telephone than actually interacting with people in real life, which is crazy. I mean, like, this man was living social media culture before we even had social media. Like, he was using his phone as a social crutch before it was cool. But in 1965, he buys a tape recorder, and that really changes the game for him. And this is what he says about his acquisition of the tape recorder. He said, "Getting my tape recorder really finished whatever emotional life I might have had, but I was glad to see it go. Nothing was ever a problem again because a problem just meant good tape. And when a problem transforms itself into good tape, it's not a problem anymore. Better yet, the people telling you the problems couldn't decide anymore if they were really having the problems or if they were performing." So Andy starts carrying his tape recorder around with him wherever he goes. It's kind of like this social crutch. And he just records everything that's happening in front of him. And it's this practice that actually inspires him to write a book. And he decides that he's going to write a book, and it's going to be called A, and it is going to document 24 hours in the life of Andine. So to prepare for recording 24 hours in the life of Andine, Andy Warhol gets a huge supply of Obitrol pills, which were Andy Warhol's favorite brand of speed pills. And they were totally legal at the time. I think they probably may still be, I don't know, but they were legal at the time. And so he gets Andine all energized, and he records a day in the life of Andine. And at some point during the day, the crew, which at this point includes Andine and Edie's friend Chuck and Chuck's friend Genevieve, they all wind up at Rotten Rita's apartment. And while they're there, Brigid Berlin calls from the hospital where she has been admitted because she went to the dentist to get her teeth cleaned, and the dentist noticed that she has like black and blue bruises all over her body. It's from her pokes. She's injecting amphetamines. But the dentist doesn't know this, and so he gets really freaked out and he sends her to the hospital. And the hospital admits her, and she kind of shocks the nurses and doctors by, one, they ask what her diet is, and she says that she drinks 3 quarts of vodka a day and has no regular food. Like, she obviously eats, but she doesn't eat at regular times. And then they ask, what medications are you taking? And she proceeds to run down a list of all sorts of pills. And she's like, in her mind, she's educating the nurses and doctors because she thinks that she is more educated when it comes to pills than they are. And so she is holding court and kind of informing the medical professionals about these pills. And she tells Andine and Rotten Rita and Andy over the phone that she has stolen a blood pressure machine from the hospital and that she has plans to steal even more drugs. So this conversation gets memorialized forever in the book A, and Andy Warhol actually had plans to do like many more books. I think his plan was to follow a different person every book and just go down the alphabet. Like, so the next book would be B, and then C, all the way down to Z. So he never actually did this. This was the only book, I believe, that was transcribed from tapes in this way. He does write more books, but this was the only like tape recorder book. Andy Warhol at this stage in the factory is just like producing like a madman. And the factory really was a factory in the sense that all these people were there and they were working on producing art, and the art was films, it was paintings, it was screen tests, it was these books, it was the Velvet Underground, it was like all different facets of art were being produced. 1965 is really when the Velvet Underground starts to go full force. And you can watch my Velvet Underground video and my Mary Warno video and my Gerard Malanga video. You want to learn more about that side of the story, but they do this big event called the Exploding Plastic Inevitable at the Dom in New York City. And it's this multimedia explosion where the Velvet Underground is playing music and they paint the walls white so they can project Andy's films on the walls. And Billy Name, who was a lighting designer with a bunch of modern dance companies in Greenwich Village, he designs this crazy light show, and it's literally the first time that a rock and roll concert has a light show. They invented that. And so they have this big show called the Exploding Plastic Inevitable, where all these things are happening, the light shows, the movies, the rock bands. And Brigid and Andy, this is the only time they were really involved in the Exploding Plastic Inevitable, but Brigid and Andy sneak through the crowd, and as people are partying, they just jab unsuspecting people with speed. Like, they're just injecting people without consent, just shooting people up. And it makes the party crazy, as you can imagine. Crazy illegal. Like, can you imagine? I think I've mentioned this before, but I have an Exploding Plastic Inevitable moment in my show. And the way that we're gonna do this, like, injecting thing is, sadly, cannot inject the audience with speed. They really frown on that. But what we're gonna do is have like shots. Like, you know how you can like take like a syringe type thing? And so we'll fill it with like alcohol. And so you can take a shot where someone will like syringe a shot of alcohol into your mouth. So Brigid and Andy in my show will be moving through the crowd, injecting people with alcohol. They will not be shooting anybody up. Wish we could, kind of, but no, can't do that. But anyways, that's crazy. So they did that. And then around 1965 is also when Andy Warhol films Chelsea Girls at the Chelsea Hotel. And this is really Brigid's like big break in the Warhol world. She plays a drug dealer working out of the Chelsea Hotel, and her scene involves Ingrid Superstar. And Brigid is so committed to her role that she and everybody else there, they can't really tell if she's being serious or if she's performing. Where is the line between fantasy and reality? No one knows. In fact, she's so convincing. She's calling real people on the phone. She's calling like her high society friends and acquaintances and family members, offering them drugs, like playing this drug dealer role. And the switchboard operators at the Chelsea Hotel, they're convinced. They think that there really is like a drug deal going down. So the switchboard operators call the police, and the police come and like break up the shooting of Chelsea Girls, and they search everyone, and they only find like 2 pills that had been prescribed to Andy, so that nobody actually had any illicit drugs. But Brigid is very convincing. Chelsea Girls is the first Warhol film that is played in like a commercial theater. It premieres, I think, at the end of 1965. And it is just ripped apart, slammed, torn to pieces by critics. They hate it. The newspapers rip it to shreds. They kind of feel like at this point, everyone has been very entertained by Andy Warhol and his crew of misfits. But when they see Chelsea Girls, it's kind of apparent that these people are scary. These people are like messed up. And the idea of Chelsea Girls is that Andy follows all these different characters living in different rooms at the Chelsea Hotel, and he projects the footage side by side. So you always see like two different things happening on screen. So you'll see like somebody in this room over here and you'll hear the dialogue, and then you'll see footage of somebody doing something over here, maybe without dialogue, and it gets very mixed. And Andy says that he wants to give the audience the option of paying attention to whatever they find interesting. Kind of like an immersive show where you can go wherever you want and follow whatever storyline you find interesting. But again, everyone hates it. Everyone is terrified. And Honey Berlin, Brigid's mom, is furious, and she accuses Brigid of lowering the family. Like, she almost disowns her over Chelsea Girls. So 1968 is the year that Valerie Solanas shot Andy Warhol, and after Valerie shoots Andy, everything at the factory changes, and most of the like core factory group kind of disbands after Valerie shoots Andy. And Warhol was actually moving out of the original factory space when Valerie shot him. He was moving into a new space in Union Square that they also called the factory, but it was not the original like silver tinfoil on the walls factory. When he moved to Union Square, that became the offices for Andy Warhol's new venture, Interview magazine. And the old factory kind of falls away, and the new factory becomes all about Interview magazine, and it's way less about drugs and less, well, it's less about amphetamines. A new drug comes to town in the 70s called cocaine, and so drugs definitely still there, but the vibe is a lot different. And although most of the other factory people kind of start going their own way, Brigid Berlin sticks by Andy. And in 1969, after the shooting, Brigid is part of this really infamous prank that Andy Warhol played, where he announced that all of his paintings were actually painted by Brigid Berlin and not him. And Brigid goes along with it. She's interviewed by the New York Times. She's like, oh, happy to claim credit for all of these paintings, but it leads to a significant drop in the value of Warhol's work. And so they kind of quickly backtrack and they're like, never mind, it was Warhol. So in 1976, Brigid Berlin starts working at Interview magazine, answering the phones, and she and Andy talk on the phone every single day. And she also starts a project while she is working at Interview magazine where she is assigned to transcribe all of Andy's tapes that he's been taping at this point for years and years. And they also tape their phone conversations, which I think is really interesting. Andy Warhol and Brigid would call each other and they both would start taping at the same times. Andy, according to Brigid, Andy was much messier about these tapes. He just would turn them on and turn them off and like wasn't really careful about it. Brigid, true to her nature, was very meticulous about it, and she kind of thought of it as like a living diary. So she would turn her TV on or her radio so that in the background you could hear like what was actually happening in the media that day and kind of give a sense of like time and place. So she was kind of like an archivist almost, in a sense. And these conversations that were taped by both Brigid and Andy Warhol actually formed the basis of what would become the book, The Philosophy of Andy Warhol, which Andy wrote in conjunction with Pat Hackett. And these conversations also led to the play Pork. So Pork and The Philosophy of Andy Warhol were really collaborations with Brigid Berlin, which is funny because again, she claims that she was not an artist, but she had a huge effect on Warhol and he had a huge effect on her. So she continues working at Interview magazine, answering the phone, transcribing the tapes, and playing with her dogs. Happy and Honey Berlin were the name of her two pugs that basically like went with her everywhere she went. And in 1976, she was having gallbladder issues and she goes to the doctor, which is really wild because Andy Warhol also died from gallbladder issues. So just a funny coincidence there. They were like twins, you know, they're best BFFs, but with their gallbladder issues. And the doctor tells Brigid that there's nothing that he can do until she loses weight. And so she actually takes him seriously and she stops taking speed and she stops drinking alcohol and she goes on a diet and she loses over 160 pounds. I believe she still kind of fluctuated with her weight for the rest of her life, but for the next 20 years, she's sober. She doesn't drink, she doesn't do drugs, and she lives like a very comparatively quiet life, especially compared to her earlier years. So that's kind of interesting to me. In 2000, a documentary was made about Brigid Berlin called Pie in the Sky, the Brigid Berlin story. And during the filming of the documentary, she goes back to the Chelsea Hotel and kind of like goes through the rooms, and she finds it very disturbing. She actually says that she could not wait to get out of there and she never wanted to come back. So I think that with some space and hindsight that she did look back on the factory years, I don't know necessarily with regret, but she does see it in a new light. It's clear that with age, she kind of does understand like how scary that time was, and she is not very excited to think about that time or relive it in any way, which is really kind of understandable. I mean, like, you and we on this channel have been talking about the factory, and I assume if you're here, you have an interest in it. I have an interest in it, obviously. But even so, like, I don't know that I would want to live during that time. I mean, who am I kidding? I obviously would. I would be there in a heartbeat, but it was scary. I mean, like, it really, I think it probably sounds a lot more thrilling to hear about it after the fact than maybe it was to live through it, but I could be wrong. Anyways, all that being said, Brigid Berlin made it. She lived a very long life, and she died the summer of 2020 when COVID hit New York and like everything was in lockdown. She passed away, and she had health issues for a while leading up to that point, so I don't think she died from COVID. But it's really interesting that she actually was still alive really, really recently. I was living in Manhattan myself in 2020 when COVID hit, and I remember that summer. It was really crazy. Lockdowns, the protests, like everything was very wild summer of 2020. And I remember hearing the news that Brigid Berlin had passed away, and I was shocked that she was even still alive, actually. So, I guess we're gonna leave it there. That's the end of her story. That's when she died. So thank you for watching. I really, really genuinely appreciate it. If you made it to the end of the video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't. I would really appreciate it. And I would love to hear who you want to hear about. I'm curious. I have a lot of videos planned and like people I want to cover and topics and everything. So like plenty more videos down the pipe. But I'm very intrigued if there's somebody that you want to hear about. So if there is somebody that you're interested in, that you want to know more about, let me know, leave a comment, and maybe I'll add it to the list. So thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.